Don't take it joining us.
I wonder how
Your
to
own
do that.
personal note taken.
I think we can activate it.
But it would be, we ought to be able to activate one session, as it were, as well.
Do you know how to do it? Activating the note taker. No, I don't.
It comes on automatically, doesn't it?
Not for ATH.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Yes, I think it's time we need to start, unless there are other objections. But let me welcome you all this afternoon to our first series of the webinar series for the year 2025. Today, we are privileged that in our midst we have Professor David Nguyen, who will be presenting to us on a topic as previously secreted. So in brief, Professor David is a professor of philosophy of education in the Faculty of Education at Stellenbosch University, and today she'll be presenting us on a topic on decolonization in South African universities, storytelling as surveillance and discrimination. Storytelling as a deep manifestation of decolonization, and like the tradition, we'll give 30 minutes to present today. And then the discussant today will be Professor Mikateko Matebula from Higher Education and Human Development, who will have 10 minutes to present. After that, we'll allow for Q&A for all members. So we encourage you to engage with the presenter. As you can always tell that the topic is quite engaging, but also quite interesting, especially within our line of work. So I'll quickly hand over to Professor David the floor, and then after 30 minutes, I will allow Professor Mikateko to come to respond. Professor David, your floor, thank you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for this invitation, and I'm really looking forward to presenting as well as to hearing the response. And I think most importantly, for my purposes, to get some questions, because I think that's going to be where the real discussion happens. I've mentioned earlier that I'm experiencing some technical problems. It's possibly where I am at the moment. So when I present, I'm going to put off my camera, but I'll put it back on once I've done presented. Okay, so let's get started. So the topic today is on storytelling. And from the outset, I want to be clear about this word storytelling. It's not just about telling stories. In other words, it's not about making up fictional accounts. When we talk about storytelling in philosophy, what we have in mind is the story of individuals. What informs us? What shapes us? What values do we have? What are our experiences, most importantly? So I just wanted to clarify that concept. So we know, I don't have to say too much about our South African context. It's especially ripe, I think, for this kind of research. There's absolutely no shortage of debates on the fact that despite all the attempts at transforming our higher education institutions and democratizing our institutions through practices such as massification of students, for example, we have not really succeeded in creating inclusive educational spaces. For many of our historically marginalized communities and students, that sense of marginalization has not dissipated with access, particularly into historically white institutions. Immediately, I want to emphasize that the concern here is not only on historically white institutions. I think it would be remiss of me to pretend that it is. I think we have other kinds of concerns coming out of so-called historically Black institutions, where students who carry identities that are not South African are increasingly finding themselves in situations where they are not included in the day-to-day participations and just contributions in those sites. And we are seeing a growing literature on xenophobia, on Afrophobia, that's particularly being experienced by other African nationalities in South African institutions. So the idea of storytelling for me has always been something that I'm interested in, because I'm just so aware of the fact that allowing access to students into your classroom or into your institution does not translate into their participation. And I see this every single time I lecture. And if you have a big class, you're always going to encounter a dominant group. And in my setting, Stellenbosch University, historically white institution, very much in an enclave geographically and socially and politically, I think it's a lot more pronounced, where any minority groups, and that word is not an easy word for me to use, but I'll come back to that. But any identity groups that are not seen as being dominant are rather silent in a traditional classroom setting. So the importance then to actually get that student to participate and to feel a sense of belonging in the classroom can only happen if we put in place the necessary mechanisms of getting to know that person. So I want to start with a somewhat different quote that comes from a different context. And this is from somebody at the TRC. And for those of you who don't know what the TRC is, so I'm just closing a door. The TRC refers to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which happened in South Africa in 1995, and it was chaired by the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And the whole idea of the TRC was, it was very focused on forgiveness and reconciliation. And there are criticisms leveled against the TRC because I think there was a strong emphasis on forgiveness to the extent that many people felt that social justice had not rendered. That because there was this idea of sharing stories for the purposes of reconciliation, many victims felt that the epistemic harm, or as well as the physical harm which they had suffered during apartheid, had not been given full recognition, and that perpetrators had in fact not been held to justice. But what struck me is this particular quote from Lucas Sikwe Pere, and he says, "I feel what has been making me sick all the time is the fact that I couldn't tell my story. But now it feels like I got my sight back by coming here and telling you the story." And the background story to this quote is the fact that he actually was blinded by whatever torture he suffered, and he did not regain his sight. So this is a metaphoric description. And significantly, he's not too concerned about not getting his sight back. He focuses on the fact that he was able to tell his story. And I think what that means, and certainly in the discussion going forward, is this idea that when I tell my story, I am seen, I am heard, I'm given recognition. And I think that's what we are trying to get at. It's about bringing into our spaces the multiple experiences that constitute the lived realities of students. Now, so that's a good example, right? Now we move to a negative, and this is where my research sits, right? So these accounts that I'm going to show to you here came out of sorry, is somebody saying something? No?
No.
Okay. So these accounts, this was done during the height of Open Stellenbosch. There was a lot of unhappiness about the treatment of Black students in these spaces, and not just in classroom settings or on campus, but also in residences. And you know, the first one for me is a profound account, and where this young woman says, "I feel like it's wrong to be Black. I sometimes ask myself when I'm alone, why did God make me Black? When a lot can happen in a good way when you're otherwise." And then she goes on to explain that she often assimilated, she changed the way she spoke, she changed the way she carried herself so that she could be more acceptable. The next person says, "The color of my skin in Stellenbosch is like a social burden. I mean, just walking into spaces, there's that stop, pause, and stay where people cannot believe that you would enter this space." And so from this example, we get this very profound experience of imposter syndrome. I don't have the right to belong here. And I'm definitely going to be touching on that as well. And then the last one is being Black within the Stellenbosch community. You know that you're not accepted, and you kind of ask yourself, what's wrong with me? Like, what did I do wrong? In the beginning, I actually started to assimilate, you know, wanting to lose myself and attain whiteness. maybe this will work better and they'll accept me more because I'm trying to be like them. And I realize that I cannot do that. I'm not willing to sell my soul to whiteness. I have to be proudly black. So these just 3 accounts, okay? And it gives, and remember, whatever voices that we do secure in our research, that's just the tip of a very deep iceberg, because many students are so disempowered, they feel so marginalized that they don't even want to participate in these kinds of research because of fear of any sort of repercussion, despite assurances of anonymity, but also because of concerns about vulnerability. And that's worth noting when we embark on these kinds of research. So what's happening here? So let's look at this philosophically. Let's try to make sense of this idea. If you look at this quote here, for example, that people stare at me when I enter this space, that I don't have the right to be here. Now, I think all of us in this room, including myself, we would have had experiences where we would have felt out of place, right? There's a sense of, gosh, I don't really belong here. I better be careful of how much of myself I bring into this space so that all of me does not become a problem. And so it's a negotiation. Now, within colonial settings, and here it's also important to really be clear about how we understand notions of post-colonialism and decolonization, because I think often we get lost in these terminologies. Firstly, we understand colonialism to be the dominance of an imperial power over an indigenous community. It's the complete desecration of indigenous way of life. It's a violence of language. It's a violence through military. It's a violence through architecture. It's a violence through adopting particular religions which you might not have had initially. And it's a complete violation of an indigenous way of life. Okay. And South Africa, as an easy example, really has a rich history here in terms of having suffered 2 sets of colonialist settlements, in terms of the Dutch came first and then the British came. And then the Dutch came again and the British came again. So we had 2 sets of those, and which is why we have these languages, Afrikaans and English. And then, of course, just after that, when we thought we were out of the woods, once the Brits left South Africa again, along came apartheid. And so, but colonialism, following the works of people like Maldonado Torres and many others like him, people like Santos as well, are very emphatic about this idea that colonialism does not end once the colonizer leaves, that what remains is what they call a coloniality of being. In other words, the way of life of the colonizer remains, and it remains in the language, it remains in our architecture, it remains in our schooling, it remains in our curriculum, in the texts we use, in the pedagogies we use, and it pretty much remains as the norm by which people are expected to live. It's the desired way of being, and this is referred to as a coloniality of power. So, but what colonialism succeeds in doing, long after its departure, it relegates bodies to either zones of being or zones of not being human. And there are many other ways to describe this. People like Sarah Ahmed talks about rightful and wrongful occupants of certain spaces. And the world has been made along a particular normative idea whereby whiteness is accepted as the normative center and everything else is measured against that. So that's the invisible zone, right? Where you don't get, there's no problem in you accessing the public sphere. Nobody is questioning why you are there. There's no doubt about your competence, your qualification. It's a given that when there's a white person in the room, and with all due respect to people in the room right now, I'm just giving you an idea of the philosophical approach being used here, that whiteness is seen as a de facto point of knowledge. It is, we don't question it. And so this is why people like Maldonado Torres talks about the fact that there are certain people who are assigned a sense of being, knowledge, as well as value, as opposed to those who are seen as diverse bodies and are seen to be without knowledge. And so hence, we see this very clear lines between whose knowledge matters and whose knowledge doesn't. And if you look at a subject like history, for example, the questions we have to ask here is whose history is being told, whose narrative is being foregrounded, are all voices being taken into account in the retelling of a particular historical account. And so we find, particularly in colonized communities, there are silences about the lived experiences and the realities and the knowledges and the values and the right to be known when it comes to indigenous communities, or what's commonly referred to as your minority groups, despite them being the majority for obvious reasons, right? Also, I want to emphasize that this kind of world where there's a center and a periphery, right? And this kind of construction of the world into binaries in terms of those who belong and those who do not belong, do not only exist in colonized or in colonized communities or in colonies. You're going to find the same kind of mentality operating in liberal democracies. And this is why and I mean, right now, we are at a center of an incredible storm with a very, I'm trying to be very polite here now, with a seriously questionable American president coupled with an obscenely wealthy billionaire who's literally inserting themselves into all kinds of politics to the extent where South Africa is being told how to run its own country. And that's also the extent to which colonialism doesn't need to be geographically located. It doesn't need any administrative structures. It just needs that power to be dispensed. And so we see it in liberal democracies. We see the treatment of immigrants. We see the rise of the far right now. We see the situation in Palestine as well. It's the reproduction of the colonialist project. And so this idea that colonialism is something in the past because the colonizer has left, it's completely misplaced. And so we have to understand that the way the world functions is that it accommodates certain bodies and certain colors, certain skins of bodies find belonging immediately by virtue of the color of that skin, while others, like our students in our universities, they experience alienation, they experience isolation. And this is not just a matter of a linguistic alienation of I don't understand academically what's happening. It's got to do with a very sense of how do I find myself in this space, and how do I live in this space while being Black. So I'm just going to move on. So when we talk about decolonization, it's not, there's no kind of idea here that we can ever get to a point of erasing colonialism. There's going to be no erasure here. There's not going to be a removal of anything. The best we can get to with decolonization is firstly to question the hegemonic constructions and norms, to question the way the world operates, to question why minority groups are treated in the way they do, to question why certain epistemologies are given normative characteristics and are accepted unquestioningly, and to question the reproduction of socioeconomic oppression and equality. So we first bring into question, and then we begin to say, can we look at the different ways in which the world actually exists? Can we move away from the center? And can we recognize that the center, which is contained by whiteness, is not the entire world? And that center cannot be used as the yardstick against which all other forms of existences are measured. And so people like Bambara, for example, and his co-authors talk about looking at multiple worldviews, a plurality of perspectives, ontologies, epistemologies, methodologies, so that we can get to a point of not only alternative, because this word alternative might also be problematic, but to look at additional ways of thinking. And so centrally at an argument for stories, as I will get to in a minute, is this idea of epistemological pluralism, that every single one of us right here on the screen, who's present in the room on the other side, and myself, we each come to this particular moment with our own stories. We each come to this particular moment with our own shaping and our own and our own lived realities. So what do I mean when I talk about epistemological pluralism? What we have in mind here is that a recognition, firstly, that to date, and if you look at South Africa, again, we have 12 official languages, including sign language. But if you look at the treatment of that linguistic diversity, it's abundantly evident that preference has been given to our colonialist inheritance. We have not prioritized indigenous languages in a way that our constitution purports to do, or even how the SA Schools Act pretends it does. So for many, many multiple reasons, our young children from the outset, when they start school, they are at a serious disadvantage. Some might be fortunate enough to experience mother tongue instruction at the foundation phase, but for most kids, that's not a reality. And they enter a learning environment or a schooling environment where they are forced to learn in a language that is not their own. And it's not as if it's a second or a third language, it's a foreign language. So the way that we have enacted our democracy has not taken full account of this pluralism. It's taken a textual account and a policy account. It's not taking a practical account in terms of making sure it's enacted. If you look at our universities, the exact same scenario is unfolding. There is very scant regard. Now, universities justify this because by saying, certainly Stellenbosch does, by saying, well, we want to be an international role player. And in order to be an international force, we need to speak in an international language, and that's English. But at the same time, these arguments are not mutually exclusive. It is possible to make room for both. And so when we talk about pluralism here, we need to take into account not only looking at our curricula, and thus far, much of the debate on decolonization has been, how do we decolonize the curriculum? I'm arguing for a pluralism which gets into the heart of what we know and why we know what we know and how we have come to know what we know. And so it's about dismantling the dominant narratives that we have accepted as the only norm, and recognizing, when I talk about epistemologies, what I have in mind here is the fact that pluralism in this regard has to involve creating a space where different knowledges can be brought into a room. Now, obviously, this is not going to be possible if we have a situation where everybody speaks in a different language, right? But there are means for us to navigate those spaces through translation, because in many occasions I have found, and with certain students, when they have a problem or a struggle, whether it's in their research writing, whether it's in just how they access their own learning, they struggle to even explain the problem to me in a different language. So it's finding points of access by understanding the nature of knowledge and how it has been produced during colonialism, and perhaps most importantly, how it has been denigrated through colonialism, and assigning renewed power and authority and recognition to different forms of knowledge, and not only different forms of knowledge, but also the different acquisitions of knowledge. And here specifically, I'm thinking about the importance of oral traditions, such a powerful way of dispensing knowledge, yet it's completely excluded from Western understandings of what knowledge looks like. Now, how do we do this? And I'm pressed for time, so I'm trying to get through all the slides. We do this We know we've tried massification, we've changed policies, we've had affirmative action, we've had employment equity, we have a preoccupation, certainly at historically white institution, in looking at representations of diversity. How many black students, how many so-called colored, how many so-called Indian, how many white, how many foreigners? It's exhausting, right? And it's not a deep form of transformation. It's a surface representation of transformation, and it's not enduring. And we know it's not enduring because whenever there are student protests, very quickly, it's not just about the fees. It's about the fact that people who look like me are still having to beg to be let into the center. That people who look like me are still not prioritized in the global scheme of education. So the only one here I drew on the ideas of Ndlovu-Kacheni, and if you haven't read his work, please, I invite you to engage with his work. He's a tremendous scholar on post-colonialism and decolonization. And he talks about prioritizing the human question. And I think this for me is at the heart of the story, because it's only when we get to the human question that we begin to ask the question of who are these students that we are so intent upon getting into our universities. You know, these masses of historically excluded identities that it becomes a performative exercise of tick, tick, tick. We never ask who they are. Where do they come from? What are their realities about themselves? What are their sense of identity? Do they have a positive sense of identity, or have they internalized the suffering and oppression and sense of inferiority which apartheid and colonialism has enacted? And so what I'm arguing for is we cannot look at this decolonization project only as a content or curriculum-based initiative, or as let's change the policies, let's change the names of buildings, let's change the names of streets. That we need those changes, but it's by far insufficient to get to the heart of decolonizing people's hearts and minds. And so to quote Ndlovu-Kacheni, he says, through decolonization, we must deal with the human question, the ontological question, the patriarchal question, the power question, the racial question, and the corporatization question. There is a need to decentering so that other lives come also to the center, and the very idea of the center then disappears. And as you can see from that quote, he brings to bear all the intersections, because we are never just one identity, right? We always, our race plus our gender, plus our culture, plus our religion, plus our language, plus our class, plus our sexuality. So, and I'm just mentioning a few there. So we are intersected beings. And so when we talk about decolonization, we have to unpack all of those layers and not simply the surface. Storytelling leads us towards restoration. How? If we look back at the quote that I shared at the beginning, it simply means now I have shared my story, and I have shared with you the human behind the suffering. I have humanized the victim. And so it's about, in a context of the university, it's about making sense of the identity of students by creating spaces for them to tell us their stories of how they arrived at this point. What is their community like? Are they the first person? And very often it's first generation students we are dealing with. There's absolutely no historical reference points for most of our students when they come into university settings. The burden of responsibility in being a first generation student is immense. There's expectation. There's often financial investment from community members. So these burdens come in with them. We have to look at the internalization of oppression. And this is why our students are silent. They don't believe that they have voice. They don't believe they have the right to a voice, and hence the silence. We have to unlearn the impositions of reduced modes of being, and we have to assume the rightful places. Now, here immediately I want to add, and I'm so pressed for time, I want to add that when we talk about storytelling, it's not simply listening to the stories of marginal or marginalized or minority group students. It's about listening to the voices of all students, right? Because apartheid succeeded not only in its oppression of the majority of South Africans, it also succeeded in convincing white students or white individuals of their own superiority. And so we have to begin to unlearn the epistemic violence which has normalized our society. We have to find a way to unpack what we know and why we know something. What do we believe? Why do we think the world is the way we think it is? How do we open ourselves to new ways of thinking and being? And so when we invite young people to tell their stories, we are opening them up to the possibility, firstly, of saying to them, you have ownership of your story. You have agency and you have autonomy. And so an emphasis on storytelling for me is on learning from and learning with. So it's not only learning about students, so we know about them, it's also a matter of learning with them. And so in just to conclude this, because I want to give time to my colleague to respond, stories can be rehumanizing. It holds the potential for students to reconceive themselves and to think differently of themselves in relation to the world. And we have to understand storytelling is immensely powerful because it really allows people to give accounts of themselves from themselves. It also allows us to subvert the theorization that has happened to marginal communities. This idea that the colonizer tells our story when the colonized knows the story far better, and the colonized also knows the story of the colonizer far better because the colonized has been forced to adopt the ways of the colonizer. And I think most importantly, what storytelling does is it sensitizes us to the lived realities of others. And what it does is it makes us become more compassionate. We have empathy because now I know who you are. I understand your story. I'm going to stop there. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to allow some time for some response. Stop sharing.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
Thank
pleasure.
you so much, Prof, for quite an interesting presentation, but also very thought-provoking. I think my colleagues and myself also can agree and attest to that. So to my colleagues, both in the room, but also those online, I just wanted to mention that I'll invite you now to reflect on the comments, questions after Professor Mikateko's response. For those who are online, you can always raise your hand or type in the chat box. And I think for those who are in the room can take the floor once that session comes. Now I'll invite Professor Mikateko to respond to the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Jemimwe, and thanks, Prof. David, for your lovely presentation. It was nice to listen to you and to read through your paper because I've been thinking about the value of storytelling or dimensions of storytelling in my own work from a research perspective. And I say we because I usually work with my colleagues on different projects with young people, looking at different aspects of their identity, their backgrounds, their experiences, and how this affects the way in which they can fully achieve their potential within universities and have these transformative relationships with knowledge and so on. I've used methods like digital storytelling and photo voice and reflected on different ways in which they can enhance narrative capabilities. So in the same way that you talk about the effective opportunity to tell one story and to be heard. And there we drew particularly on Michael Watts's work on narrative capability. And then we connected it to the capability for epistemic contribution, looking at Miranda Fricker's work on epistemic contribution and thinking about different ways in which the connection or the relationship between these capabilities are central to decolonization, but I haven't thought about it in the way that you so explicitly link these two capabilities to decolonization, talking about how they are central to the process as a means of epistemic restoration so that students can realize their full potential within universities and have that transformative relationship with knowledge. I really enjoyed listening to how you so carefully took us through the connection between decolonization and how storytelling brings release to the repression and shame inflicted through colonialism and apartheid. There are some questions that I have, and some of them are linked to my own reflections on how to think about and use storytelling in ways that are ethical and that allow for the achievement of this rehumanization, as you talked about, and for storytelling to achieve its decolonial potential. The first one is related to how we do the listening. So I don't think that the potential of storytelling in terms of decolonization can be achieved without sort of proper acknowledgement. And I remember giving a workshop on the power of storytelling, and one of the participants at the end said, but what's the point of telling my story if nothing changes and no one cares? So there's something there about how we do the listening in ways that are genuine to truly acknowledge the stories that are being told. And this also made me think about one of the exhibitions that we had at the end of a Photo Voice project, and we were quite surprised that despite the event being widely publicized, there seemed to be little interest in the university to attend these types of exhibitions where they would have the opportunity to hear student stories directly from them. So that's about listening and how we do that. The second question is, I guess, also related to aspects of listening, and this has to do with how we situate emotions or where we situate emotions when stories are being shared. Here I'm thinking about how difficult it is for people to be vulnerable and to tell their stories when we haven't had the opportunity to build trust between each other. And this is, with among students themselves, or between students and researchers, or between students and lecturers. And very often we know that when stories are being told, when people are telling stories and their experiences and so on, at its best, storytelling helps us tap into our humanity, but you also deal with a range of emotions. It could be rage, it could be anger, and it could also be empathy, which is what we're hoping for. So I guess the question there is how have you been thinking about the best way to situate emotions in these storytelling processes? And then the last question, I think, has to do with plurality and appreciating other world views and epistemologies. And in your paper, you mentioned that there is a strong resistance against African philosophy and different ways in which it might inform the ethos and culture of universities. So I was wondering if there are some examples that we can draw from where we see the valuing, the incorporating, or the embracing of such African philosophies in universities. I think I'll leave it there for now and just thank you again for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Professor Mikateko. I don't know, Professor Davis, do you want to respond to that, or we open the Q&A so that maybe you can respond to some of the questions that come up?
I think I'm going to respond. These are really important questions, and I thank Professor for that. It's this is the joy of these kinds of sessions, that you begin to really think about your own research, right? And you want these kinds of questions. So I'm going to respond to a few as best as I can, and then please, I really want to open up to everybody else as well, so people do feel they've come here and actually gotten some questions answered. Yeah, absolutely. Without the willingness to listen, there seems to be a sense of, well, what is the point? I'm sitting here and I'm sharing and I'm spilling very personal information to you, and I'm making myself vulnerable, but there is no sense. And I think what's remarkably missing, and the way I've tried to deal with this, certainly, and you see, this is not only about the content we teach, and this is where the teacher in me comes through. It's not only what I teach in my classes, it's also how I teach. And it's got to do with the kinds of presence that I bring. How accessible am I to students? But coupled with that is this idea of what's missing in our education system, whether we're talking primary, high, or tertiary, is this word called curiosity. We really do not pay too much attention. We come to our classrooms with predetermined curricula, prescribed texts. We tell our students, this is what we need you to read if you want to get through this particular module. This is what I'm going to test you on. And there's really no need for students to be too curious because we've already decided what they have to learn and how they're going to learn it. And I find that we have to actually, in our classrooms, through our teaching, it doesn't really matter what subject we are teaching, we have to come into our classrooms with a lot more questions and uncertainty rather than certainty. We've got to invite students into our teaching. We've got to make them, and I like using the Socratic way of teaching, of dialogue. It's something I thrive upon. Inviting students into dialogue with me, just walking into a classroom. Tomorrow I have my first class for the year. And I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to walk in there, I'm going to pose all these controversial questions. And some of them will be unsettled by me because they're also unsettled by the identity of me. I have no doubt about that, right? I understand that. So what I'm trying to say is sometimes we've got to use the professional identity of being an academic, a teacher, or a researcher, or a student, and to use that as part of that curiosity. At the same time, we've got to awaken curiosity amongst those we teach, so that there is a natural kind of awakening of, I wonder about the other. I wonder about the person next to me. And this is not something, if I ask you right now, how much do you know about the people around you at the moment, right? It's a very basic question. We don't necessarily like asking those questions because we feel we might be accused of being inquisitive. At the same time, to your other question, it's this issue of vulnerability and trust. Now, the quick answer here is, and I've written on the topic of vulnerability, is that vulnerability is not necessarily a negative emotion. This idea of I'm making myself weak, I'm exposing myself. Oh, and now you know something about me, and so now I'm exposed. That's not a weakness. That's a strength. Because it says, I'm comfortable with this part of myself. It's okay for you to know I grew up in poverty. I come from a background where we did not have access to a dignified toilet. We relied on a pit latrine. We had to go and bath outside. This is my story. This gives you an idea of my reality. So you see what colonialism has done, and the word came up in this word called shame. We have shame about ourselves because we were told to have shame about ourselves. We were told we were less than. And we've got to begin to unlearn that language. We've got to say, no, actually, there's no shame in where I have come from or who I am, or that I don't know who my parents are because my father died when I was young, or he left our family and we've never seen him again. And that's such a common story, right? There's no shame in that. That's not my shame. So we have to begin to reclaim these words, these concepts, and recognize that emotions do not need to be justified. If there's anger, there's rightful anger. If there's frustration, there's rightful frustration. It's how we couch that. And so it's really about understanding vulnerability as a strength. The issue of trust is complex, right? Fortunately, I've also written on the importance of epistemic trust. And again, it's how do we establish who is trustworthy? And we all know how this works. We trust somebody until that person proves to us that that person cannot be trusted. And again, for me, telling my story cannot be dependent upon somebody else. I don't need you to trust my story. I don't need to be able to trust you with my story. This is not about you. It's about me reclaiming my knowledge, the knowledge about myself, reclaiming the story so that I can make sense of myself in relation to others. And I think the power of storytelling, it absolutely needs a listener. And this can be cultivated through pedagogical styles, through creating a classroom that's filled with curiosity, where learners are, it's not something seen as a supplementary activity. For me, it's not about teaching a lesson and then saying at the end of it, okay, well, now let's share our stories. That's not how this works. You can create those spaces. You can have workshops. Those are amazing. I've done those. But in the classroom setting, it's perfectly possible for you to invite voices into your classroom in a very spontaneous way so that students can begin to feel this is a safe space. It's a comfortable space. She allows multiple perspectives to come in the room without any judgment. And so the issue of trust really isn't too centrally, because there's no way of knowing what somebody is going to do with the information that you have shared. And sometimes we've got to accept that how a story lands is beyond our control. How it is received or what happens to it, it's beyond our control. There are issues here, right? It would be silly of me to say there aren't concerns here. For some people, the emotional burden of sharing a story, unloading for the first time, becomes a deeply disturbing emotional process, because the very idea of just wording experiences, assigning words to experiences, becomes an emotional undertaking. So there has to be a sensitivity about how we go about this. This storytelling scenario that I've tried to sketch can only happen when there's a pre-existing relationship at play. That there is a sense of we've interacted before, whether it is between a supervisor and a student or a teacher in a classroom. And the most important thing with storytelling is that when we invite different identities into our universities or into our classrooms, the first port of call for us must be to understand who they are. And then as we begin to get to know them, the sharing of stories happen. So the sharing of stories should not be seen as an isolated event. And then, of course, we know that some people will choose to tell their stories in stages. They will give you one particular extract of, and they'll choose certain things that they are careful about. And the next time you see them, they might share something else with you. I want to just get to the other one quite quickly. The issue of resistance. There's always going to be resistance to this because this is not seen as normative. It's not seen as the business of the university, right? The business of the university is to teach the curriculum, produce the student, and then there we are. It's about producing the research. It's about theorizing about certain debates and certain concepts. We're not too interested in the lived realities of people. So in my own institution, I think there's some resistance to it. That has not deterred me. I have remained quite steadfast in the way that I teach, in the way that I supervise, in the way that I interact. I've intentionally created forums for people just to have conversation, whether it's outside under a tree. Let's just get to know each other. Particularly, it's much easier with my postgrads because they're a smaller group, so you can do that. I don't think we should be too concerned about the resistance. I think the mere fact that there is resistance should actually encourage us to keep on doing it. There are implications here, obviously, particularly if we work with stories and ethnographies, because by virtue of me telling my story, I implicate others, right? And that's the reality. And this is the criticism that's leveled against research on storytelling and narratives and ethnographies and autoethnographies. Who are you implicating? And there's a way that I can tell my story without assigning name to others, right? The fact that I might know certain things about you because of implication, that's an unfortunate reality. But it's about reclaiming my own truth. And the resistance to that, I think the whole idea of decolonization is a form of resistance by itself. So it should not be seen as a negative. it's possible for us to re-signify that resistance into a powerful means of making sure that we keep on pushing, and eventually the pushing becomes the center. And certainly for me, that's the aim of what I'm hoping to achieve here. I'm going to stop speaking at this point.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that rich response. Our colleagues, I will now invite questions and reflections or any inputs to the presentation, both from the room but also from those online.
I think Chimamanda can't see you. Oh, can you? There's a hand up here in the room.
Okay, go ahead.
Thanks, Chimwemwe. I'm kind of right
Go
on
ahead.
the side of the frame. Thank you so much for that very rich and very stimulating presentation. And like Mikateko, I use a lot of storytelling strategies in my own research. So I want to make clear that I speak from a platform or a position of a very, very strong support and utilization of storytelling strategies. So I have a question and I have a comment. So the one question I think which is lobbied, or the criticism I suppose, which is directed at storytelling methods, is that they are seen to be very local. So to be powerful at the level of the local and the micro, but to have had much less of any impact on the macro. So if one goes back to the TRC, which you mentioned at the beginning, that had something like 20,000 cumulative voices talking about their experiences, and yet it didn't generate social justice for the same people who were speaking. So I'm interested in your thoughts on this connection between the micro and the macro and the elusiveness of social justice in our context, but also how we can get elites to listen. So you were talking about resistance on the part of the university, but in some ways I know it's a form of resistance, but in some way it's less about resistance and it's more about a complete lack of interest, which I suppose is a form of resistance. It's not like the university is pushing back. It's just that they don't care. They don't see this as particularly important. So that's the question. The other is a comment, which I suppose is probably addressed to my colleagues in the research group. I'm really curious as to how the arguments around decolonization, coloniality, and so on play out in the context of neighboring countries. How they are perceived, how they are taken up, how they are changed, because people like Mignolo and Maldonado Torres and others, in Global Gacheni as well, who are developing these frameworks, they operating at, again, a very kind of macro level. But how do these things play out? What is distinctive about the way in which coloniality and decolonization might play out in the context of Zambia, for example? So I'm just putting that out there to colleagues where race might be infected in a rather different way, and so on. But yeah, I mean, I thought that was a lovely presentation. It was just such a nice way to start the year. But I'd be interested in your comments about the articulation of the micro.
Thank you for that. Those are really great questions, all of them. So yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the TRC example, in many ways it did not attain what it set out to do, and I think, I mean, as I'm the first to acknowledge, social justice did not prevail, and social justice continues to elude us. So what was the point of that? I'd like to think that perhaps the problem with the TRC was the fact that it adopted a particular position from the outset where it was not really a matter of achieving justice. I don't think that was the intention. If you look at the brief of the TRC, the words reconciliation and forgiveness as a means of the country moving forward, it was largely described by people like Villavicencio as a bridge from the past into the present. And I think the burden of responsibility on the TRC, if you think about the volume of testimonies that needed to be heard, was just so unfair. I don't think it would ever have been reached any other different conclusion considering the time frame that it needed to operate in. So that's my view on that, right? I don't think that the intention there was social justice, to be honest with you. If I look at the issue of storytelling in a more contained situation like a university, because now we have a longitudinal setting. We now have the chance of incoming students 3, 4, 5 years in a degree in a particular degree program. We have them for a much longer time. We also in an educative setting. So the context lends itself to a very different kind of approach where we can begin to talk about this. What do we understand by social justice? What is it? When do we know that we've reached a stage of social justice? What does that look like? Now, to your question, how do we translate this from the micro to the macro? I think part of the challenge here, and I think part of the resistance to storytelling, or I think the dismissal of storytelling, is because it's seen as untheoretical, right? It's not seen as carrying any sort of theoretical validity. That people say, oh, it's just one person's story. Where's the empirical evidence? And again, it's this normative idea of what constitutes research and what constitutes theory. And so this idea that we think that theory is something cast in concrete, when we all know theory is just somebody's idea that will hold for a certain time and not hold for a certain time, which is exactly why we invite students to critically engage with theories. But storytelling, I think, it has been largely couched as such, and hence the dismissal. So for me, the power of it, however, and there's a certain power when something gets sidelined because or gets looked at differently, because it does give you more room to play around within. So the reason why I persist with it is that it has to first take root, I think, at a human level. And this is where I think the resistance does sit, that we don't like talking about the human question because that's the hard work. We prefer talking about the theoretical debates and the policy debates. We don't want to know about the who and the why. We only want to know about the how. There might be some truth. Some would agree with the assertion that these stories do not translate to a macro level. My own experience, certainly when I've taken these debates into conferences and international webinars, I'm beginning to see shifts. So even in my own work, in my book called Out of Place, which was an autoethnography, I was absolutely astounded to see the responses that I got from people who on the surface had nothing in common with me. So in other words, my story as a Muslim academic growing up in apartheid found resonance with American white colleagues growing up in very different contexts, as well as New Zealand, as well as Turkey, as well as Pakistan, just to cite a few. I think storytelling needs time, and I think we have to nurture it and give it that time. I don't think we're going to see the immediate advances because it's seen as such a personal first person account. But I do think it's possible, if not to share the actual kind of private accounts of people specifically, but to share the experiences of storytelling. Those can become translatable, I think, into macro settings, into macro understandings. What happens in the room when we share? What are the emotions that are evoked when I tell my story? How do we listen? What learning happens? How do we unlearn things? And this word unlearning for me is critical here, because again, the university spends so much energy on the fact that students need to learn. They are learners and we are the teachers. And these dichotomies are incredibly unhelpful. We need to get, and academics as well, firstly. And I find that the storytelling amongst academics is even more important than those of students, because it is us who are going to and pretend to be the teachers of these students. Unlearning is critical as well, because there are certain ways of the world that we have adopted and certain perspectives which we have never ever critiqued. We've never checked our stereotypes. We have never checked our biases. We've simply accepted them as taken for granted. So storytelling has the capacity to do that. And those changes might be at a micro level now, but I'd like to believe that the more we do this and the more we instill curiosity, that can be translatable into macro settings, into macro settings. No, I haven't covered all your questions.
Thank you. Thank you. That's really helpful. Interesting.
Oh, thank you so much, Prof. Unfortunately, it's 2 o'clock, so
wow.
we may need to cut the conversation. But I mean, beyond this platform, we still encourage members to engage, and I'm sure that as the tradition within the center, people still behind and still dissect and also reflect on some of the things. I think for those who are online directory, I think I provided the email, which would be cool. And I think, yeah, thank you so much, Prof. David, for this stimulating but also enriching presentation. And also a big thanks to Professor Mikateko for responding quite so well to the presentation. It's been quite engaging listening to, and also very, very interesting. To the members of the group, both online but also those in the group, also thank you for participating, but also for your comments. Like I said earlier, we encourage further engagement outside this platform, and it's been a good day. So maybe to end this, we can give a round of applause, and then we'll end the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. So
Thank you.
at this stage, we can say bye for those who are online. Until then, see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.